Hi everyone, I am this week's discussion leader for the excerpt we read, A Vernacular Use in School, Evolution of Responses and Related Challenges. So an overview of this article is that Nero discusses how vernaculars have come to be constructed as problems in educational settings through overt and covert enactment of ideologies and policies and the evolution of responses to them. So to give some early history, in the 18th century, it was a period that promoted a monolingualist orientation of languages. So languages were thought to be unique and separate identities tied to specific communities and identities. Language standardization was promoted and thus reversed the previous acceptance of vernacular. Prior to the 18th century, it was widely used amongst people of every color and it was accepted. So language standardization is what reversed that idea that it was okay. So this is also the era of the standard language ideology, which favored a specific form of language, which is the standard language we know in schools today, and condemned vernacular language in school settings as bad language, as wrong, as ignorant. And SLI also suggests a synchronic view of language, which is that the standard variety cannot be changed. This view is interesting because we view the past change of language as normal and acceptable. The example that the article gave was that Shakespeare's English was vastly different from ours and from British English today, and we accept that. That was changed, and we accept the new form of English, but we will not accept a future form of English that is different than the one we have today. And languages were seen as owned by specific communities that were considered homogeneous and pure. So English belonged to England, and by extension, English belonged to people from England. So some language discrimination from marginalized groups in the school system surround the cultural deprivation theory, which is the idea that those from a lower socioeconomic bracket are culturally deprived due to little exposure to literacy and standardized language taught in Western schools. The deficit theory is that vernacular speakers are thought to have lower IQs than speakers of standardized varieties. And African American vernacular English speakers were thought to need speech therapy and remediation. And we can also see in this political cartoon on the right side of the screen how marginalized students were treated by teachers who used standardized English as a form of education and preferred it over vernacular and viewed those who spoke vernacular as uneducated and illiterate. And we also have the eradicationist agenda, in which people wanted to eradicate vernacular use because of its cultural deprivation implications. So considering people thought that people from a lower socioeconomic bracket were culturally deprived due to not being exposed to standardized English and only speaking the vernacular, people wanted to eradicate the vernacular completely and would even, on some levels, abuse students who used vernacular in schools with flogging. They would get in big trouble if they spoke any type of vernacular. So they really wanted to completely rid it in the school system and in the language of their students. Now, the standard language ideology was the SLI from the 18th century. So the standardized language varieties are used in school for formal and standardized assessment, which is largely dependent upon student success. So when it comes to using vernacular in schools, it won't get you very far for succeeding academically, as standardized English is what is necessary to achieve straight A's, to get a 4.0, to get into college. So the SLI has created an invented linguistic tension between the language of school and the vernacular, because as we mentioned before, the vernacular used to be widely spoken prior to the 18th century and those that came to ridicule it. And we have restricted codes, which are codes that have words and structure that are predictable for speakers and listeners. So it's not complex language, it's everyday chit-chatting with friends and family. You know the words that they are more likely to use in a casual conversation. So children of the lower working class were thought to be limited to a restricted code of language, versus an elaborated code, which is where words are complex, meanings are expanded, and require verbal planning. It also promotes a higher level of syntactic organization and lexical selection. So this is the code that children need to succeed in school. It is the code that is associated with standardized English, whereas the restricted code would more so be associated with the vernacular. The elaborated code is also thought to be more available to children who are in a higher tax bracket and those that don't use the vernacular in their day-to-day basis at home. So really, groups that are not marginalized were thought to have an elaborated code, and marginalized groups were thought to only have a restricted code, and it was thought that they could not achieve an elaborated code by only using the vernacular, or by using the vernacular at all. Next, we have the language rights movement. So the UNESCO publication, The Use of Vernacular Languages in Education, in the year 1953, declared that education is best carried out in a child's vernacular. So the language rights movement came on the back of the civil rights movement, and it was to justify language between people of every culture and immigrants speaking their languages in America and using school as a resource to learn English in a way that is necessary to be in this country and thrive. You have the Bilingual Education Act, which was passed in 1968. And it was the first federal policy to assist students who didn't speak English at home to learn English in school. It provided school districts with funds for ESL programs. So the reason we are able to be in this grad program today and teach future English language learners is due to the Bilingual Education Act. We also have the act that was passed, which is students' right to their own language in 1972, and it affirmed the students' rights to their own languages and dialects. For linguistics, we have contrastive analysis, which is the idea that features of one language can be contrasted with those of another to predict or explain errors. So this contrastive approach would have allowed teachers to contrast vernacular English with standard English to raise their awareness on their differences. Now this could be beneficial for raising awareness on vernacular in the classroom and explaining the history of vernacular before it retained this negative connotation of ignorance and the language of the uneducated, of how it was spoken and widely used amongst people from all races, and how it was accepted. In a detrimental way, this approach could be used for teachers who strongly believe in standard English and strongly condemn vernacular English, so that contrasting them would try to show students that the standard English is the right language, while vernacular English is actually incredibly wrong. Now, the contrastive analysis also introduced code switching, and this was actually something students were being taught in school for how to use standard English and the grammar and the lexical dimensions that come with it, and how to switch between that standard English and the vernacular they normally speak in specific settings. For example, job interviews or in school. Switching was obviously deemed very problematic over time because it promotes ideas of prejudice and it promotes discrimination amongst people who don't speak standard English, which is more so geared toward the African American community. And code switching is something that has been widely talked about for decades for why it should be eliminated. Because it promotes a form of double consciousness, a term coined by W.E.B. Du Bois, in which people need to switch between an identity that is acceptable in mainstream white American society, including standard English and code switching, and their African American community where vernacular is more widely used. So code switching was thought to promote bidialectalism, which is the ability to switch between two dialects of English, whereas in reality, code switching promoted discrimination. Now we have the English movements of the last few decades. We have the English-only movement, which is in the 1980s and 90s. This movement rejected students or immigrants' rights to their own language and social identity and defined what counted as English. Now this is in contrast to the Students' Rights to Their Own Language Act that was passed in 1972, because the eradicationist agenda wanted to further eradicate vernacular, so the English-only movement was their attempt at continuing to do so. And then we have the Language as Rights movement, which repositions students' vernaculars as a right and a resource to be used in their educational experience. So the English-only movement was unsuccessful, and the Language as Rights movement is what repositioned the previous laws that were passed, such as the Students' Right to Their Own Language of 1972, to once again come into fruition and be useful. Now, the future of vernacular in schools is that teachers must choose appropriate vernacular texts for their students based on age, interests, etc., and must set the appropriate classroom environment for reading such texts. I know many of us have read The Color Purple in class, as is mentioned in this article. It is widely used in the United States to teach vernacular. But in order to move forward without the negative connotation vernacular has on it, teachers need to choose appropriate texts to be shared in class and to teach the history of vernacular. Because I would bet that most people don't know where vernacular actually comes from and that it was widely spoken and accepted before the 18th century. So to end with a quote from the article, language use in the past 30 years has not merely been about switching from one neatly defined code to another, but also about mixing codes and using all linguistic and semiotic resources available in speech and writing to communicate across time and space. And I think this goes to show that standardized English is simply English that has been mixed through different codes. So in the way that it is different from vernacular, it is also similar enough where each variety has been mixed and influenced by the other.